When does the search for truth inside a marriage cross a serious line and become an illegal invasion of privacy? That's really the question at the heart of a landmark case we're breaking down today, Zulueta versus the Court of Appeals. It's a case where a private dispute between a husband and wife actually forced the Supreme Court to rule on the sanctity of our constitutional rights, even within the bonds of marriage.
So, let's set the scene. We're in Manila. The year is 1982. We're inside the medical clinic of a Dr. Alfredo Martin. And an event that took place right here on this one day would kick off a legal battle that was going to travel all the way to the highest court in the land.
All right, so here's how we're going to walk through this case. First up, we'll look at the forcible search that started this whole thing. Then, we'll get right to the core legal question at stake. From there, we'll dig into the Supreme Court's answer and, crucially, the constitutional reasoning behind it. We'll also explore the inviolable right that this case protects, and finally, we'll cover the court's final order. So, what exactly went down in that clinic? Let's reconstruct the events that really sparked this entire legal firestorm.
Now, what's really important to notice here is how deliberate this was. The petitioner, Cecilia Zulueta, didn't just happen to find these documents. Nope, she showed up at her husband's workplace, and not alone. She had her mother and a driver with her. Then, right in front of his secretary, she forcibly pried open his private drawers and a cabinet. This wasn't some quiet discovery. It was basically a raid that ended with her seizing a whole bunch of his personal papers.
And we're not talking about office memos here. Look at what was taken. Private letters, diaries, even his passport. I mean, these are intensely personal items, and they were seized with a very, very clear purpose in mind.
And there it is. That's the motive. Mrs. Zulueta took these things to use as evidence against her husband. She had filed for legal separation and was also trying to get him disqualified from practicing medicine. This right here is what sets up the central legal drama.
So you can see how this action creates a direct conflict, right? It forced the courts to weigh two really fundamental principles against each other. And that brings us to the core legal question of the case. So it all boils down to this. Does wanting to prove something like marital infidelity in court give you the right to just take your spouse's private property without their consent? And maybe more importantly, can evidence you get that way even be considered legally admissible? This lays out the conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got our legal system, which is all about finding the truth, and evidence is the key to doing that. But on the other side, our Constitution guarantees a fundamental right to privacy, the right to keep our personal lives and our communications secure. So, which one wins out here? Well, after the case made its way from the regional trial court to the Court of Appeals, it finally landed in the lap of the Supreme Court. And their answer? It was incredibly clear and decisive. And there you have it. The Supreme Court declared that the documents and papers Cecilia Zulueta took could not, under any circumstances, be used as evidence. The way she got them made them completely useless for her case.
But why did the court rule this way? That's always the most important part of any decision, right? So let's look at the ratio decidendi, the legal reasoning, which is grounded directly in the Constitution itself.
The court went straight to the source. Article 3, Section 3, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution is just unequivocal. It doesn't say inviolable unless you're married. It just says inviolable, period. This is the absolute bedrock of our right to privacy.
And then comes the kicker. The Constitution itself tells you what happens if you break that rule. Paragraph 2 creates what's known as the exclusionary rule. It says, flat out, that if you violate that right to privacy, the evidence you get is inadmissible. You can't use it for any purpose in any proceeding.
So the court just connected the dots. They said this protection applies to absolutely everyone. Getting married doesn't mean you somehow surrender your individual constitutional rights. The only way to legally get into these private communications would be with a lawful court order or maybe if public safety was at risk. And neither of those exceptions was even close to applying here.
And all of this reasoning really solidified a powerful legal doctrine that still resonates today, defining the boundaries of privacy even in our most intimate relationships.
This right here. This is the key takeaway from the entire case. It's an incredibly powerful statement from the court. It confirms that your integrity and your right to privacy as a person are not just absorbed or waved away when you get married. The Constitution's shield is always there for you.
And this brings us right back to that core legal mechanism we've been talking about, the exclusionary rule. To put it simply, the law says that if you get evidence by breaking constitutional rules, in this instance, the right to privacy, you can't benefit from that illegal act in court. The evidence just gets thrown out. It's excluded. All right, so finally, let's look at the disposition. This is the formal, final action that the Supreme Court took, and it brings this whole legal journey to an end. And so, that's the final word. The Supreme Court denied Cecilia Zulueta's petition, which means they agreed with the decisions of the lower courts. The order was crystal clear. The private documents had to be returned, and they could not be used as evidence against Dr. Martin.
And that brings us to today. This case, decided decades ago about physical letters and diaries, leaves us with a really critical question. In our world of emails, text messages, and social media, how does this fundamental principle, that marriage is not a waiver of privacy, apply to our digital lives? That right there is the enduring legacy of Zulueta versus the Court of Appeals.